The evening air hung thick with humidity as Dr. James Whitfield rode his horse up the winding path to Magnolia Hill Plantation. The grand white columns of the mansion loomed against the darkening sky, silhouetted by the last rays of the setting sun. As the newly appointed physician from Philadelphia, he had been summoned to attend to the mistress of the house, Mrs. Eleanor Montgomery, widow of Colonel William Montgomery, and now the sole proprietor of one of the largest cotton plantations in Warren County. "You've arrived just in time, Doctor," said Mr. Simmons, the plantation overseer, as he took the reins of James's horse. "Mrs. Montgomery has been expecting you. She's most concerned about certain conditions among her workforce." James nodded, retrieving his medical bag. At 32, he had come south not only to establish his practice, but to document the medical conditions of both white plantation owners and the enslaved population. His abolitionist leanings remained carefully hidden. In Mississippi, such views could prove fatal. The interior of Magnolia Hill was oppressive despite its grandeur. Dark mahogany furnishings, heavy velvet draperies, and portraits of stern-faced Montgomerys watching from gilt frames. The air smelled of beeswax, lavender, and something else, something medicinal that James couldn't quite identify. "Dr. Whitfield, how good of you to come." Mrs. Montgomery appeared at the top of the sweeping staircase. A tall woman in her 50s, with iron-grey hair, pulled severely back from a face that might once have been beautiful. Her black mourning dress rustled as she descended. "Mrs. Montgomery, I came as soon as I received your message." "Yes, well, we have a delicate situation requiring your expertise. Several of my female slaves have fallen ill with a mysterious malady. My sons, Frederick and Thomas, are concerned it might spread to the household." James noticed how she emphasized her son's concerns rather than her own. "I'll need to examine the patients immediately." "Of course, but first some refreshment. You must be tired after your journey." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Over brandy in the parlor, Mrs. Montgomery spoke of her late husband, the plantation's yield, and her sons who were currently in New Orleans on business. James listened politely, but his mind was on the task ahead. "Mrs. Montgomery, about the ill women—" "Yes, Doctor. There's something you should understand about Magnolia Hill." She lowered her voice. "We run things differently here. Colonel Montgomery had progressive ideas about breeding. Our bloodlines are carefully managed." A chill ran through James that had nothing to do with the evening breeze from the open window. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "You will. Tomorrow you'll see everything. For now, rest. Patience, Doctor. Some secrets reveal themselves only to those who wait." As James was led to his quarters in the east wing, he passed a locked door from which he heard soft weeping. The sound followed him into uneasy dreams of shadowy figures and women's voices crying out in the dark. Dawn arrived with a heavy mist clinging to the cotton fields surrounding Magnolia Hill. James awoke disoriented, the unfamiliar ceiling above him momentarily confusing, until memories of the previous evening returned. Dressing quickly, he found Mrs. Montgomery already at breakfast, reading correspondence through small gold-rimmed spectacles. "Ah, Doctor, I trust you slept well, though I imagine the heat takes some adjustment for northerners." "Well enough, thank you." It was a lie. His sleep had been fractured by nightmares and the persistent sounds of movement in the hallway outside his room. After a silent breakfast served by an elderly enslaved man whose eyes never left the floor, Mrs. Montgomery set aside her letters. "Now, Doctor, it's time to attend to business. We'll visit the infirmary." The infirmary, as she called it, was a long, low building, set apart from both the main house and the slave quarters. Unlike the crude cabins where most enslaved people lived, this structure was solidly built with proper windows and a slate roof. James noted the iron bars on those windows with growing unease. "This building was my husband's particular project," Mrs. Montgomery explained as she unlocked the heavy door. "He believed in scientific improvement of our stock." The clinical detachment in her voice made James's skin crawl. Inside, the building was divided into small rooms, each with a narrow bed. The air smelled strongly of carbolic acid and something else, a medicinal scent James had detected faintly in the main house. "These women are experiencing similar symptoms," Mrs. Montgomery continued, leading him to the first room. "Fever, fatigue, abdominal discomfort." Inside, a young woman lay on the bed, her dark skin ashen with illness. Her wrists were loosely bound to the bed frame with soft ropes. She turned frightened eyes toward the doorway as they entered. "This is Mercy," Mrs. Montgomery said, as though introducing a prized mare. 20 years old, strong birthing hips, already delivered 2 healthy children. Her symptoms began 3 weeks ago. James approached slowly, setting his medical bag on a small table. "I'm a doctor, Mercy. I'm here to help you. May I examine you?" The woman's gaze flicked to Mrs. Montgomery, then back to James. She nodded almost imperceptibly. As he began his examination, James spoke softly, asking questions about her symptoms. Mercy answered in whispers, her eyes constantly darting to the doorway where Mrs. Montgomery stood watching. "When did the bleeding start?" James asked, after noting her elevated pulse and the unusual bruising on her inner arms. "After the procedure, sir," Mercy whispered. "Procedure? That's enough questions, Doctor," Mrs. Montgomery interrupted sharply. "These women are prone to fantasy. Examine her physically and make your diagnosis." As James continued his examination, he discovered evidence of recent childbirth. Yet according to Mrs. Montgomery, Mercy's youngest child was 3 years old. More disturbing were the puncture marks in the crook of her arm, similar to those he had seen on patients receiving experimental blood transfusions in Philadelphia. By the time they had visited 3 more women, all with similar symptoms, and all with the same fear in their eyes, James was struggling to maintain his professional composure. Each woman showed signs of recent reproductive trauma. Each had the same puncture marks, and none would speak freely in Mrs. Montgomery's presence. "Well, Doctor?" Mrs. Montgomery asked as they exited the infirmary. "What is your diagnosis?" "I need to review my findings," James replied carefully, "and I'd like to return later to check on their progress." "Of course. Though I must insist you share your preliminary thoughts. We value medical science at Magnolia Hill." "The women appear to be suffering from some form of infection," James said, choosing his words with extreme care. "I'm concerned about the puncture marks on their arms." Something flickered in Mrs. Montgomery's eyes. Amusement, pride. "My late husband was fascinated by the new medical techniques from Europe. We've been implementing some of his theories." As they walked back toward the main house, James noticed a small stone building partly hidden by magnolia trees. Smoke rose from its chimney despite the warm day. "What's that building?" he asked. "Our laboratory," Mrs. Montgomery replied. "Perhaps you'd like to see it. After dinner? My sons should be returning from New Orleans by then. They'll want to meet the new doctor who's going to help continue their father's work." The way she said "continue" made James's blood run cold. The laboratory. The word echoed in James's mind as he sat through an interminable dinner. Mrs. Montgomery had changed into a deep burgundy gown that made her pale skin look bloodless in the candlelight. The dining room walls were adorned with botanical illustrations, not the usual decorative flowers, but detailed anatomical drawings of plants, their reproductive organs labeled in Latin. "My husband was fascinated by breeding," Mrs. Montgomery explained, following his gaze to a particularly detailed illustration of plant fertilization. He believed the principles that apply to plants and livestock could be applied more broadly. James forced himself to eat despite his churning stomach. Did he publish his theories? "Oh no, Doctor. Some knowledge is too precious or too controversial for public consumption." She sipped her wine. Colonel Montgomery understood that progress requires vision unfettered by common morality. Before James could respond, the front door opened and male voices echoed from the entrance hall. Mrs. Montgomery's face transformed, softening with genuine affection. "My sons have returned," she said, rising. Frederick and Thomas Montgomery entered the dining room, both tall men in their 30s, with their mother's patrician features. They had the confident bearing of men accustomed to absolute authority. "Mother," the elder one said, kissing Mrs. Montgomery's cheek, "we concluded our business successfully." "Excellent, Frederick. Gentlemen, this is Dr. Whitfield from Philadelphia." The brothers assessed James with identical calculating gazes that reminded him of specimen collectors examining a new butterfly. "The doctor has been examining our patients today," Mrs. Montgomery explained. "And your conclusions?" Thomas asked, helping himself to wine without sitting. "I've seen evidence of medical experimentation," James said carefully, "and what appears to be reproductive trauma." The brothers exchanged glances. "Direct, isn't he?" Frederick remarked to his mother. "Refreshingly so," she replied. "The doctor has agreed to visit the laboratory after dinner." James had agreed to no such thing but remained silent. He needed to see this laboratory, to understand what was happening at Magnolia Hill before he could decide how to proceed. Dinner continued with discussion of cotton prices and the brothers' business in New Orleans, which appeared to involve negotiations with medical suppliers. James noted how they avoided specifics in his presence. After the meal, the four of them walked to the stone building James had noticed earlier. Up close, it was larger than he'd first thought, with a heavy iron door that Thomas unlocked with a key from his waistcoat. "Our father began his work 20 years ago," Frederick explained as they entered. "What you see here represents his life's achievement." The interior was illuminated by oil lamps that cast long shadows across walls lined with bookshelves. Scientific instruments, microscopes, glass vessels, distillation equipment covered long tables. One wall was entirely occupied by cabinets with small drawers, each labeled meticulously. Colonel Montgomery believed that selective breeding could be directed scientifically, Thomas said, moving to a large ledger open on a central desk. He kept detailed records of every experiment. James approached the ledger, noticing it contained columns of dates, names, and clinical observations. With growing horror, he realized he was looking at reproductive records of the plantation's enslaved women, with notes on their breeding outcomes. "This is monstrous," he whispered before he could stop himself. "This is science, Doctor," Mrs. Montgomery corrected coldly. "My husband discovered that direct intervention in the natural process yields superior results." Frederick moved to a cabinet and removed a small glass vial filled with cloudy liquid. "We've refined the technique considerably. Extraction, preservation, and targeted implementation. The medicinal smell was stronger here. The preservative solution," James realized with dawning horror. They were extracting, preserving, and deliberately implanting reproductive material. "Why show me this?" James asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Because we need a physician who understands our vision," Mrs. Montgomery replied. "Someone to help refine the process. The current method has too high a failure rate. Too many women falling ill afterward." "You want me to participate in this abomination?" Thomas smiled thinly. "Participate? Doctor, you misunderstand. We're offering you the opportunity to advance medical science beyond what your colleagues in Philadelphia could imagine." "And if I refuse?" Mrs. Montgomery's eyes hardened. "Then you'll have an unfortunate accident on your return journey to Vicksburg. So many dangers on these country roads." The threat hung in the air as James realized the full extent of his predicament. He was miles from town, surrounded by people who viewed human beings as breeding stock and who would not hesitate to eliminate an obstacle to their scientific ambitions. "I'll need time," he said finally, "to study your father's records, to understand the procedures you've developed." "Of course," Mrs. Montgomery agreed, seemingly satisfied. "We're not barbarians, Doctor. We're visionaries." And as they left the laboratory, James noticed a small door at the rear of the building. Through its window, he glimpsed what appeared to be surgical equipment. He knew then that he needed to escape Magnolia Hill, and somehow help the women imprisoned there. James was given free access to the laboratory the following day, ostensibly to study Colonel Montgomery's records. The family seemed to believe that scientific curiosity would overcome his moral objections, or perhaps they were simply confident in their ability to silence him should he prove uncooperative. The ledgers revealed a methodical horror beyond anything James had imagined. For nearly 2 decades, Colonel Montgomery had been conducting what he called controlled breeding interventions. The earliest records documented simple forced reproduction between enslaved people selected for specific physical traits. But the later entries, those dating after the Colonel's travels to Europe 7 years earlier, described something far more calculated. He had learned techniques for extracting and preserving male reproductive material and had begun experimenting with artificial insemination. Most disturbing were the entries from the past 3 years, after Frederick and Thomas had returned from medical studies in France. The donations, as they clinically termed them, now came exclusively from the Montgomery men themselves, the Colonel before his death, and subsequently his sons, creating a superior bloodline while maintaining property rights. One entry explained in cold, meticulous handwriting, the offspring retain enslaved status, but benefit from superior Montgomery genetic material. James felt physically ill as he read account after account of women subjected to these procedures without consent, then carefully monitored through pregnancy and childbirth. Children resulting from these experiments were given special status on the plantation, housed separately, given different work assignments, and meticulously observed for evidence of inherited Montgomery traits. By midday, James had pieced together enough of their methodology to understand why the women were falling ill. The preservative solution the Montgomerys used for the reproductive material contained mercury compounds, which were poisoning the women upon insemination. It was a miracle Moore hadn't died from the treatments. He needed to document what he had discovered, but more urgently, he needed to escape and bring help. As he contemplated his options, the laboratory door opened, and Thomas Montgomery entered, carrying a tray. "Mother thought you might appreciate some refreshment," he said, placing the tray on a desk. "How are you finding Father's records?" "Comprehensive," James replied neutrally. "Your father was thorough in his documentation." "Indeed. Scientific progress requires meticulous record-keeping." Thomas poured tea from a silver pot. "Have you formed any theories about why our subjects are falling ill?" James hesitated, then decided to offer a partial truth that might gain their trust. "I suspect the preservative solution is causing toxic reactions. Mercury is known to have poisonous effects." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "We considered that possibility. What would you suggest as an alternative?" "There are newer methods being developed in Europe," James improvised, "but I would need to send for specific supplies from Philadelphia." "Write a list," Thomas said. "We can have the items procured." As they spoke, James noticed something he had overlooked in his initial examination of the laboratory. A small desk drawer left partially open, revealing the gleam of a pistol within. "One thing puzzles me," James said carefully. "Why show me all this? Surely you recognize the risk." Thomas smiled coldly. "Because capable physicians willing to pursue this kind of research are rare, Doctor, and because we've taken precautions." He sipped his tea. "No one knows you're here except our overseer, who is devoted to this family. Your driver was sent back to Vicksburg with a message that you'll be staying at Magnolia Hill indefinitely to treat a serious illness." The implication was clear. James had vanished as far as the outside world was concerned. No one would come looking for him. "I see," James said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Then I should focus on solving your medical problem?" "Precisely." Thomas seemed pleased with James's apparent acceptance. "I'll leave you to your work. Dinner is at 7. Mother expects you to report your preliminary findings." After Thomas left, James waited several minutes before approaching the desk drawer. The pistol was small, but appeared functional, loaded with a single bullet. He slipped it into his coat pocket, heart pounding. Next, he quickly penned 2 notes. The first was the supply list Thomas had requested, filled with plausible-sounding but non-essential medical items. The second, hidden beneath the blotter, was a desperate message describing the horrors of Magnolia Hill and his own precarious situation. If he could find a way to get this second note to someone, perhaps one of the house servants who might travel to town, there might be hope of exposure. But even as he contemplated this plan, James knew the chances were slim. The Montgomerys had maintained their secret for decades through careful isolation and absolute control. As dusk approached, he heard a soft knock at the laboratory door. Quickly hiding the note, he called, "Enter!" It was the elderly man who had served breakfast the previous day. He shuffled in with downcast eyes. "Mrs. Montgomery asks if you require anything before dinner, sir." James studied the man carefully. "What's your name?" "Isaiah, sir." "Isaiah, do you ever go into Vicksburg?" The old man's eyes flickered up briefly, then back to the floor. "Sometimes, sir, for errands." James felt a surge of hope. "When do you next expect to go?" "Tomorrow, sir. Mrs. Montgomery needs medicines from the apothecary." Before James could say more, the door opened again, and Frederick Montgomery stepped in. Isaiah immediately bowed and backed away. "Making friends with the help, Doctor?" Frederick asked with an edge to his voice. "Isaiah, you're needed in the kitchen." As Isaiah hurried out, Frederick turned his cold gaze on James. "Have you made progress?" "Some," James replied. "I've prepared a list of supplies that might help." "Excellent. We're eager to continue our work. Mother is particularly anxious to see results before she becomes too old to witness the culmination of Father's vision." "And what is that culmination exactly?" James asked. Frederick's eyes gleamed with fanatical intensity. "The perfect merging of bloodlines, Doctor. Montgomery intelligence and breeding with the physical attributes we select for, all while maintaining our legal ownership of the resulting offspring. Can you imagine? Generations of carefully crafted human stock, all belonging to the Montgomery estate." James struggled to hide his revulsion. "Ambitious." "It's the future," Frederick insisted. "Others will follow our example once the results are proven. Now, shall we join Mother for dinner? She's most eager to hear your thoughts." As they walked to the main house through the gathering darkness, James felt the weight of the pistol in his pocket. One bullet. If escape proved impossible, he might at least be able to destroy some of the Montgomery research, or stop one of them permanently. But first, he had to find a way to help the women in the infirmary and somehow get his message out to the world. The horrors of Magnolia Hill could not remain hidden any longer. Dinner that evening was an exercise in controlled terror. James maintained a careful facade of professional interest, while Mrs. Montgomery and her sons discussed their project with disturbing enthusiasm. They spoke of the enslaved women as vessels and the resulting children as specimens, their language a grotesque parody of scientific discourse. "We've identified optimal traits for different purposes," Frederick explained, carving the roast with meticulous precision. "Field labor requires one set of physical attributes, household service another. And you believe you can selectively breed for these traits?" James asked, forcing himself to play along while memorizing every detail. "We've already demonstrated success," Mrs. Montgomery said proudly. "The 3rd generation is showing remarkable consistency in the selected traits. Thomas, show the doctor the photographic plates." Thomas retrieved a leather portfolio from a sideboard and spread several daguerreotypes across the table. They showed children and young adults with striking combinations of features, the Montgomery family's distinctive eyes and nose on individuals with darker complexions. "All of these are Montgomery bloodline," Mrs. Montgomery said, her voice soft with pride. "All legally our property, yet carrying our superior traits." "Fascinating," James managed. "And the mothers of these children, they're all still on the plantation?" A shadow crossed Frederick's face. "Not all survived the earlier procedures. Before we refined our techniques, there were losses, which is precisely why we need your expertise, Doctor. Thomas added smoothly. To reduce those unfortunate incidents. James nodded slowly. I believe I can help minimize the adverse reactions. The mercury compound is the primary issue. Excellent, Mrs. Montgomery said. We have a procedure scheduled for tomorrow morning. Perhaps you would like to observe. James's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to nod. That would be most instructive. The subject is a young woman named Esther, Frederick said. 22 years old, excellent physical condition, no previous pregnancies, an ideal candidate for first insemination. The casual cruelty with which they discussed their plans made James's hand itch for the pistol in his pocket. But he knew that direct confrontation would only result in his death and leave the women of Magnolia Hill with no hope of rescue. After dinner, citing fatigue, James retired to his room. Once alone, he carefully locked his door and began searching for a means of escape. The window was his best option, a 15-foot drop to the garden below, potentially survivable but likely to result in injury. Before he could formulate a complete plan, a soft knock sounded at his door. James froze, then quietly retrieved the pistol from his coat. "Who is it?" he called softly. "Isaiah, sir," came the whispered response. "Please, I must speak with you." Cautiously, James unlocked the door. The elderly man slipped inside, his eyes darting nervously to the hallway behind him. "I heard them at dinner," Isaiah whispered. "You're trying to help the women." James studied the man carefully. Could this be a trap set by the Montgomerys? "What do you know about what's happening here?" Isaiah's weathered face crumpled. "Everything, sir. I've been at Magnolia Hill for 40 years. I've seen what they do. My own daughter," his voice broke, "my Ruthie was one of the first. She died in that infirmary." "I'm sorry," James said softly. "Isaiah, I need to get help. Can you get a message to Vicksburg for me?" The old man shook his head. They watched too carefully. "But there's another way." He glanced at the window. "The patrol only circles the east and south sides after midnight. The north side by the old creek bed is unwatched." Hope surged in James's chest. "You're suggesting I escape tonight?" "It's your only chance, sir, and theirs." Isaiah pressed a small bundle into James's hands. "Bread and dried meat. There's a settlement of free blacks 10 miles north. Ask for Mother Esther. Show her this." He handed James a small carved wooden token. "She'll help you reach the authorities." "Why haven't you tried to escape?" James asked. Isaiah's eyes filled with tears. "Too old, sir, and they keep the families separated. My grandson is in the nursery. I couldn't leave him." A terrible understanding dawned on James. "He's one of the Montgomery experiments?" Isaiah nodded, a mixture of shame and grief crossing his face. "My own flesh and blood, and they treat him like a prized horse. Please, sir, help end this." "I'll try," James promised. "What time is safest?" 2 hours past midnight. The overseer drinks himself to sleep by then, and the night guard changes at the quarters. Isaiah moved to the door. "I'll create a distraction in the kitchen. A small fire, nothing dangerous. It should draw attention away from the north side." After Isaiah left, James spent the next several hours preparing. He changed into his darkest clothes, pocketed the pistol, and tucked Isaiah's food bundle and the wooden token inside his shirt. Then he waited, watching the hands of his pocket watch crawl toward the appointed hour. At 2:30, a commotion erupted from the direction of the kitchen. Shouts about fire echoed across the grounds, and James saw figures rushing toward the source of the alarm. It was time. Carefully, he opened his window and surveyed the drop. A large magnolia tree grew close enough that he might be able to reach one of its branches. Saying a silent prayer, James climbed onto the windowsill and leapt. His fingers caught a branch, which bent alarmingly under his weight. Bark scraped his hands raw as he slid down the trunk, landing with a painful jolt that sent shockwaves up his legs. For a moment, he crouched in the shadows, listening for any sign that his escape had been detected. Hearing nothing but the continuing commotion from the kitchen, James began moving northward, staying close to the shadows of the trees that bordered the manicured lawn. The moon was mercifully veiled by clouds, providing additional cover as he made his way toward the creek bed Isaiah had mentioned. Just as he reached the edge of the plantation grounds, James heard a shout behind him. Turning, he saw Frederick Montgomery standing on the back porch of the mansion, pointing in his direction. There, by the north fence. James abandoned stealth and broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush toward the creek. Behind him, he could hear dogs beginning to bark and men shouting. The hunt had begun. The creek bed was dry, a shallow gully cutting through the woods north of the plantation. James stumbled along it, the rocky ground treacherous in the darkness. His lungs burned and his legs trembled with exhaustion, but fear drove him onward. Behind him the baying of hounds grew louder. Isaiah had said 10 miles to the settlement. Even at a strong pace, that would take hours. Hours James didn't have with dogs on his trail. He needed to throw them off his scent. Veering into a shallow pool where water still collected in the otherwise dry creek, James waded through it, then followed a fallen log across to the opposite bank. It was an old trick, one that might buy him a little time, but wouldn't fool trained hunting dogs for long. The woods grew thicker as he pushed northward, brambles tearing at his clothes and skin. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs beneath his feet, seemed magnified in the night air, betraying his position to his pursuers. After what felt like miles, but was probably less than one, James spotted a dilapidated cabin half hidden among the trees. Approaching cautiously, he found it abandoned, its roof partially collapsed and its door hanging askew on rusted hinges. Inside, the cabin smelled of decay and animal droppings. Moonlight filtered through holes in the roof, illuminating a dirt floor and the remains of crude furniture. It wasn't safety, but it might offer a moment's respite and a chance to think. The baying of the hounds had receded slightly, suggesting they had lost his trail at the water crossing, but James knew it was only temporary. He needed to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between himself and Magnolia Hill before dawn. As he caught his breath, leaning against the cabin's wall, his thoughts returned to the women in the infirmary, to Mercy with her frightened eyes and puncture marks in her arms, to the unnamed others subjected to the Montgomerys' twisted experiments, and to the specimens they had created and were raising as prized livestock. If he survived, if he reached civilization, who would believe such horrors? The Montgomerys were wealthy, respected members of Mississippi society. James was an outsider, a northerner whose accusations would be dismissed as abolitionist propaganda. He needed evidence, something more substantial than his word against theirs. Suddenly, James remembered the daguerreotypes Thomas had shown at dinner. Photographic evidence of their breeding program, complete with their proud annotations. In his haste to escape, he had missed the opportunity to secure this damning proof. The dogs' barking grew louder again. They had picked up his scent. Time was running out. As James prepared to flee the cabin, the door creaked open. He pressed himself against the wall, hand going to the pistol in his pocket. A figure entered. Not one of the Montgomery men or their overseers, but a woman clutching a shawl around her shoulders. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Doctor, Isaiah said you might come this way." James remained pressed against the wall, suspicious. "Who are you?" "My name is Ruth. Isaiah is my father." She moved further into the cabin, and moonlight illuminated her face, young, with intelligent eyes that held the same haunted expression James had seen in the infirmary women. "I work in the big house. I heard what happened. The Montgomerys said your father's daughter, Ruth, died." A bitter smile crossed her face. "They told him that when I was taken to the laboratory. It was easier than explaining what they were really doing." She glanced nervously toward the door. "We don't have much time. The dogs will be here soon." "Why are you helping me?" Ruth's expression hardened. "Because I was one of them, one of the women they use. I was lucky. I work in the house now because I can read and write. But my sister is still in the infirmary." She pulled something from beneath her shawl, a small leather-bound book. "This is what you need Frederick Montgomery's private journal. It details everything, the procedures, the lineages, even maps of where the results are buried when the experiments fail. James took the journal with trembling hands. This could expose them. If you get it to the right people. Ruth cocked her head, listening. They're getting closer. You need to go. She pressed a small glass bottle into his hand. Turpentine. For the dogs. Sprinkle it on your trail. Come with me, James urged. Help me tell the authorities what's happening here. Ruth shook her head sadly. My children are still at Magnolia Hill. I can't leave them. Your children? Montgomery's children, she corrected bitterly, but still mine. I will not abandon them to those monsters. She moved to the door, peering out into the darkness. Northeast, about 8 miles. You'll reach a creek, a real one with flowing water. Follow it east until you see 3 tall pines growing together. The settlement is just beyond. Ask for Mother Esther. The baying of hounds was much closer now. Go, Ruth urged. If you don't make it, all of this, all of us, remain buried at Magnolia Hill. James tucked the journal securely inside his shirt and uncorked the turpentine bottle. I'll send help back for you and the others. I swear it. Ruth's smile was sad. Just tell the truth, Doctor, that's all we ask. As James slipped out of the cabin, sprinkling turpentine on his path as Ruth had instructed, he heard hoofbeats approaching from the south. The Montgomery men themselves had joined the hunt. Plunging deeper into the woods, James ran as he had never run before, the journal bouncing against his chest with each stride, a physical reminder of the testimony he carried, of the horrors he had witnessed, and of the lives depending on his escape. The night stretched endlessly before him, a gauntlet of darkness and pursuit that he must survive if the truth of Magnolia Hill was ever to see the light of day. Dawn broke in streaks of pale gold through the trees as James stumbled on, his legs leaden with exhaustion. The sounds of pursuit had faded hours ago, suggesting the turpentine had worked or his hunters had temporarily lost his trail. But James knew the Montgomerys would not abandon their chase. Not with what he carried. Frederick's journal had grown heavy against his chest, a physical burden that matched its psychological weight. During brief rests, James had flipped through its pages, his horror growing with each entry. The journal documented not just the reproductive experiments, but the fates of women who had resisted or whose bodies had rejected the procedures, clinical descriptions of suffering, punishments and deaths, all recorded with detached precision. Most chilling were the entries describing the culling process for offspring that failed to display the desired traits, children quietly removed from the nursery and never seen again. In the margins beside these passages, Frederick had made additional notes about improvements to selection criteria and waste reduction strategies. The trees began to thin, and James caught the welcome sound of running water, the creek Ruth had mentioned. Relief surged through him, quickly tempered by caution. He was still deep in Montgomery territory, where any passing traveler might recognize him from descriptions provided by the plantation owners. Staying within the tree line, James followed the creek eastward. The water was tempting, his throat burned with thirst, but he dared not stop yet. The 3 pines Ruth had described must be close. As the morning grew warmer, James's pace slowed despite his determination. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but he saved Isaiah's small food bundle for when he might truly need it. His city shoes, never intended for such a journey, had worn through in places, leaving his feet blistered and bloody. Just as James began to fear he had missed the landmark, he spotted them. 3 towering pine trees growing so close together their trunks almost touched, their needled tops swaying gently in the breeze. Beyond them lay a small clearing and what appeared to be a path. Hope renewed his energy. The settlement must be close. Mother Esther, whoever she was, and the help Ruth had promised, waited just ahead. James had taken no more than a dozen steps along the path when a voice called from the trees to his right. "That's far enough, stranger." He froze. A man emerged from the undergrowth, a rifle trained steadily on James's chest. He was older, his dark skin weathered by sun and age, his eyes sharp and suspicious. "I'm looking for Mother Esther," James said, raising his hand slowly to show he was unarmed. "Isaiah from Magnolia Hill sent me." The man's expression didn't change, but he lowered the rifle slightly. "What business you got with Mother Esther?" James hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I have information about what's happening at Magnolia Hill, information that needs to reach the authorities." "Authorities," the man repeated with a bitter laugh. "Ain't no authorities in Mississippi gonna care what happens to colored folks on a plantation." "Please," James persisted, "I'm a doctor. I was brought to Magnolia Hill and witnessed atrocities, experiments on women. I have proof." He touched the journal beneath his shirt. "I also have this." Carefully, he withdrew the wooden token Isaiah had given him. The man studied it, then nodded once. "Follow me, and keep quiet. Patrol riders sometimes come this far." The path wound through thick woods for another half-mile before opening onto a small settlement of log cabins arranged in a rough circle around a central clearing. Children stopped their play to stare as James was led past. Women paused in their washing, and men set aside tools to watch the stranger with wary eyes. The largest cabin stood at the far side of the clearing. His guide knocked 3 times on its door, then twice more. "Enter!" called a woman's voice from within. The cabin's interior was dim after the bright morning light, but as James's eyes adjusted, he made out an elderly woman seated in a wooden rocking chair by the hearth. Despite the warm day, a small fire burned, sending aromatic smoke curling toward the rafters. "Mother Esther," his guide said. "This man says Isaiah sent him from Magnolia Hill. Had the token." The woman leaned forward, her face coming into clearer view, deeply lined with age, with bright, intelligent eyes that assessed James carefully. "What's your name, doctor?" "James Whitfield, from Philadelphia." "How did you know I was a doctor?" A smile creased her face. "Isaiah has ways of getting messages to us. Said a Philadelphia doctor might be coming our way, running from the Montgomerys." She gestured to a stool near her chair. "Sit, Dr. Whitfield. You look dead on your feet." James sank gratefully onto the stool. "The Montgomerys. They're doing unspeakable things at their plantation. Experimenting on enslaved women, forced insemination, breeding programs." Mother Esther held up a hand. "We know what goes on at Magnolia Hill. Known for years." "Then why—" James began, then stopped as understanding dawned. "No one would believe you." "White authorities in Vicksburg?" She shook her head. "They'd as soon hang us all as listen to accusations against the Montgomerys. That family's been powerful in these parts since before Mississippi was a state." Despair washed over James. "Then there's nothing to be done? Those women, those children, they're just left to suffer?" Mother Esther studied him for a long moment. "I didn't say that, Doctor. I said the authorities in Vicksburg wouldn't help, but there are other authorities, other ways." She nodded to the man who had brought James in. "Elijah, get the doctor some food and water, then take him to the back cabin to rest." "No," James protested. "The Montgomerys will be searching. I need to keep moving to get this evidence somewhere. It can make a difference." He pulled out Frederick's journal. "This documents everything. Names, dates, procedures. It has to reach someone who can stop them." Mother Esther took the journal and flipped through it, her expression growing grimmer with each page. "This is worse than we knew," she said finally. "The scale of it." "I was told you could help me reach the authorities," James pressed. "And so I can." Mother Esther handed the journal back. "There's a circuit judge coming through Leeds Point next week, Judge Hammond. He's from upstate, not part of the Vicksburg circle, and he's known to have sympathies." "Abolitionist sympathies?" She nodded. "Not openly, but he's ruled against plantation owners before, in cases of extreme cruelty. If anyone might act on what you've seen, it's him." "Leeds Point is how far?" 2 days hard travel, and the Montgomerys will have men watching all the main roads." "I'll take my chances," James said firmly. Mother Esther studied him, then smiled slightly. "Brave but foolish, Doctor. There are safer ways." She turned to Elijah. "Fetch Sarah. Tell her to bring the papers." While they waited, Mother Esther had James describe everything he had seen at Magnolia Hill, occasionally asking sharp questions that revealed her own deep knowledge of the plantation and its operations. "How long has this settlement been here?" James asked during a pause. 15 years, she replied. "Started with 5 of us who escaped from different plantations. Now we're 37, including the children. We survive because few know we exist, and those who do have reasons to keep our secret." Her eyes held James's steadily. "Including you now, Dr. Whitfield." Before he could respond, the door opened, and a young woman entered carrying a bundle of papers and a small leather case. "Sarah is our forger," Mother Esther explained. "Best in 3 counties. She's going to make you a new identity for your journey to Leeds Point." The young woman smiled shyly. "I'll need a few hours and a likeness to work from." For the first time since fleeing Magnolia Hill, James felt a flicker of real hope. With new papers and guidance from these people who knew the land, he might actually succeed in bringing the Montgomerys' crimes to light. But as Sarah began preparing her materials, a shout came from outside. Elijah burst through the door, his expression urgent. "Riders coming. Montgomery men, 6 of them, asking questions at the Wilkins place down the road." Mother Esther rose with surprising agility for her age. "How far?" "Less than a mile. They're going cabin to cabin." She turned to James, her decision instant. "No time for papers. You'll have to go out the back way. Elijah will take you through the swamp. No horses can follow there." To Sarah, she said, "Hide those materials. If they search, there can be nothing to find." "The journal," James said, reaching for it where it lay on a small table. "Leave it," Mother Esther commanded. "They'll search you if they catch you. I'll hide it where they'll never look." When James hesitated, she added firmly, "I've been hiding things from white men for 60 years, Doctor. Trust me." Outside, more shouts could be heard. Time was running out. "Go," Mother Esther urged. "Elijah knows a way to Leeds Point that avoids the main roads. Judge Hammond arrives next Wednesday. If you're not there, I'll find another way to get him this evidence." As James followed Elijah through a concealed back door and into the dense undergrowth beyond, he cast one last look at Mother Esther. The old woman stood straight-backed in her cabin, the journal already vanished from sight, her eyes reflecting the same determined resistance he had glimpsed in Ruth, in Isaiah, and in the women of the infirmary. The truth of Magnolia Hill would come to light, if not through him, then through them. The Montgomerys' reign of scientific terror would end. The swamp stretched before them, a labyrinth of cypress trees rising from dark waters, their knees breaking the surface like the knuckles of drowning giants. Spanish moss hung in grey veils, creating a twilight world even in midday. "Stay close," Elijah warned, stepping onto a barely visible path of higher ground that wound between pools of brackish water. "Step only where I step. There's quicksand and sinkholes that'll swallow a man whole." James followed carefully, his city-bred instinct screaming at the alien landscape. The air hung heavy with decay and vegetation, buzzing with insects and occasional splashes as unseen creatures moved through the water. Each sound made him flinch, imagining Frederick Montgomery and his men closing in from behind. "They won't follow us here," Elijah said, correctly reading James's anxiety. "Montgomery men don't know these paths. Even if they did, they're too proud to wade through muck like common folk." "How far does this swamp extend?" "Far enough. We'll come out near the old Spanish mission, then take the deer trails to Leeds Point." Elijah glanced back. 2 days, if we keep a good pace. Judge Hammond won't be there until Wednesday." They pushed on through the afternoon, the path occasionally disappearing into shallow water that rose to their knees before finding solid ground again. James's feet, already blistered, burned with each step, but he forced himself to continue. The journal might be safe with Mother Esther, but his testimony was equally important. The first-hand account of a Philadelphia doctor would carry weight that no amount of documented evidence could on its own. As dusk approached, Elijah found a relatively dry patch of ground beneath a massive cypress, its base creating a natural shelter. "We'll rest here," he decided. "No fire. Too damp anyway, and might draw attention." James sank down gratefully, finally opening Isaiah's small food bundle, hard bread and dried meat, enough for one meager meal. He offered half to Elijah, who accepted with a nod of thanks. "You knew about Magnolia Hill before I came," James said as they ate. "Why has no one stopped them?" Elijah was silent for a long moment. "First white man asked me that question," he said finally. "Why? Because the Montgomerys own half the county. Because a slave's word means nothing against a master's. Because even the worst things you saw in that journal wouldn't shock most plantation owners. Might give them ideas instead. Not all would condone such practices," James protested. "Maybe not, but enough would look away." Elijah took a small drink from a water gourd. "Every few years, someone escapes from Magnolia Hill. They find their way to us with stories. Each time we send word north through the underground. Each time promises come back that something will be done. And nothing changes." "This time will be different," James insisted. "I've seen it with my own eyes." "A white doctor's testimony, with the journal as evidence." "Maybe," Elijah conceded. "Or maybe Judge Hammond will listen politely, then write to his friend Colonel Montgomery about the wild tales being spread about Magnolia Hill." The cynicism in Elijah's voice stung, because James couldn't dismiss the possibility. The Montgomerys' power and connections ran deep. "If you believe it's hopeless, why help me?" James asked. Elijah's smile was tired but genuine. "Because Mother Esther believes in you. And in all my 53 years, I've never known that woman to be wrong about a person's character." He settled back against the tree trunk. "Get some sleep, Doctor. Dawn comes early in the swamp." Despite his exhaustion, sleep came fitfully to James. Every night, sound, the call of an owl, the splash of something moving through water, jolted him awake, expecting to find Montgomery men surrounding their crude camp. When he did sleep, his dreams were haunted by the women from the infirmary, by Ruth's sad eyes, by Frederick Montgomery's clinical descriptions of failed specimens. They set out again at first light, the swamp veiled in a thin mist that turned the landscape ghostly. By mid-morning, the ground had begun to rise slightly, the water receding, suggesting they were nearing the swamp's edge. "Another few hours," Elijah confirmed when James asked. "Then we skirt around the settlement at Pine Creek. Too many eyes there, some friendly to the Montgomerys, for the right price." The sun was high overhead when Elijah suddenly raised his hand, signaling for silence. James froze, listening. At first he heard nothing unusual, just the omnipresent drone of insects and occasional bird calls. Then, faintly, the sound of voices carried across the water. "Down," Elijah whispered, dropping to a crouch behind a fallen log. James joined him, peering cautiously over the rotting wood. Through the trees, he could make out two men in a small, flat-bottomed boat, poling their way through a narrow channel about 50 yards away. One held a rifle, scanning the shoreline as his companion navigated. "Montgomery men," James whispered. Elijah nodded grimly. "Thomas Montgomery himself in that boat, the other's their tracker, Davis." James felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. If Thomas was personally searching the swamp, it meant they had somehow traced his route from the settlement. "They've found Mother Esther's place," he realized aloud. "Likely," Elijah agreed, his voice tight. "Question is, did they find what they were looking for there?" The implication was clear. Had they discovered Frederick's journal? Had Mother Esther and the others suffered for sheltering James? The boat continued its slow progress, moving parallel to their position, but showing no sign that its occupants had spotted them. James and Elijah remained motionless until the vessel disappeared around a bend in the channel. "We need to keep moving," Elijah said once the boat was out of sight. "They're searching the main waterways. Stick to the high ground." They proceeded with even greater caution, Elijah leading them on an increasingly circuitous route that prioritized concealment over speed. Progress slowed to a crawl, as they frequently stopped to listen for pursuit. By late afternoon, They had reached the swamp's edge, where cypress trees gave way to pine forest. The ruins of the old Spanish mission Elijah had mentioned were visible in the distance, crumbling stone walls half reclaimed by vegetation. "We'll rest there briefly," Elijah decided. "Need to see if the road to Leeds Point is being watched." Deal. The mission offered little shelter beyond its partially intact walls, but after the close confines of the swamp, James welcomed the relative openness. As Elijah scouted the nearby road, James examined his blistered feet, wincing as he pulled off sodden socks to reveal skin rubbed raw by his inappropriate footwear. "Road's clear for now," Elijah reported upon returning, "but there's sign of recent riders. We'll need to stay in the woods alongside it, not on it." "How much farther to Leeds Point?" 15 miles or so. We won't make it by nightfall. There's a place about halfway, old hunting cabin. We can shelter there." James nodded, pulling his socks and shoes back on despite the pain. "Elijah, if they found Mother Esther's settlement—" "Don't think on it," Elijah cut him off. "Mother Esther's survived worse than the Montgomerys. Focus on getting to Judge Hammond." They set out again, keeping to the tree line that bordered the narrow dirt road to Leeds Point. The going was slower than on the road itself, but the cover of the forest offered security that outweighed the inconvenience. As dusk approached, Elijah grew increasingly alert, checking their back trail frequently. "Something's not right," he murmured after one such check. "Been too easy since the swamp." "What do you mean?" "Thomas Montgomery in that boat, he's a hunter. Bred to it. Should have found our trail by now." A chill ran down James's spine that had nothing to do with his damp clothes. "Unless they're not looking for us anymore. If they found what they wanted at Mother Esther's, or unless they know where we're headed and are waiting rather than chasing." Elijah finished the thought. Leeds Point. Judge Hammond. The implication hung between them. If the Montgomerys had somehow learned of their destination, there was no need to track them through difficult terrain. They could simply set an ambush closer to town. "We need to assume they're waiting for us," Elijah said grimly. "Change the plan." "How? Judge Hammond is our best hope. Not the only hope." Elijah thought for a moment. "There's a Union sympathizer in Leeds Point. Newspaperman named Thaddeus Miller, prints the County Gazette. If the Montgomerys are watching for you to approach the judge—" "I could reach Miller instead," James finished. "Get the story into print." Elijah nodded. "Frederick Montgomery's journal would be better, but your testimony might be enough to spark investigation." He looked up at the darkening sky. "Too late to change course now. We'll push on to the cabin for the night, reassess at dawn." They continued for another hour, the forest growing darker around them, before Elijah spotted the hunting cabin, a small, sturdy structure built against the side of a low hill. It appeared abandoned, its single window dark. "Wait here," Elijah whispered, drawing a long knife from his belt. "Let me check it's empty." James watched as the other man approached the cabin cautiously, circling it once before trying the door. After a tense moment, Elijah beckoned him forward. "No one's been here in months," he reported. "We'll be safe enough for the night." The cabin's interior was sparse, a crude table, 2 stools, and a platform bed layered with moldering straw. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, though Elijah vetoed lighting a fire despite the evening chill. "Too visible," he explained. "Montgomerys might not know about this place, but their men patrol these woods sometimes. They shared the last of Isaiah's food and settled in for another uncomfortable night." James's body ached with fatigue, but his mind raced with possibilities and fears. What if Judge Hammond was indeed a Montgomery ally? What if Mother Esther and her settlement had suffered for helping him? What if his escape, rather than exposing the horrors of Magnolia Hill, had only driven them deeper into secrecy? Outside, an owl called, the sound eerily similar to the weeping James had heard from behind the locked door on his first night at the plantation. He wondered if he would ever forget that sound, or if he even should. Some horrors deserved to be remembered, to drive the pursuit of justice. Sleep finally claimed him, but it brought no peace, Only dreams of women chained to beds, of Frederick Montgomery's clinical notes, and of children with Montgomery eyes being raised like prized cattle, never knowing they were born of scientific atrocity. Dawn arrived with a heavy mist shrouding the forest, reducing visibility to a few yards. James and Elijah set out early, moving more slowly than the previous day due to the poor conditions, but thankful for the additional concealment the fog provided. "Leeds Point is northeast," Elijah explained as they picked their way through the underbrush. "If we keep a steady pace, we should reach it by mid-afternoon." The air warmed as morning progressed, burning off some of the mist, but leaving a hazy quality to the light filtering through the trees. Birds called overhead, and occasionally small animals rustled in the undergrowth, each sound making James tense until he identified its source. They stopped briefly at a small stream to drink and rest. James's feet had gone from painful to almost numb, a development that worried him, but which he kept to himself. Every step toward Leeds Point was a step toward justice for the women of Magnolia Hill. His own discomfort was irrelevant. "Tell me about this newspaperman," James said as they prepared to move on. "Miller, will he be sympathetic to our cause?" Elijah considered the question. Miller's not an abolitionist, not openly, but he's printed stories about plantation cruelties before, carefully worded, mind you, focused on the most extreme cases. Lost some advertisers over it. And the Montgomerys haven't silenced him? They've tried, from what I hear. Threatened his business, tried to buy the paper. But Miller has connections in the North, family in Boston who back him financially, makes him less vulnerable than most. Elijah shouldered his small pack. Still, approaching him is a risk. The Montgomerys might be watching his office too. The fog had mostly dissipated by midday, revealing a landscape of rolling hills and increasingly scattered trees as they approached more settled areas. Twice they were forced to hide as riders passed on the nearby road, though neither group appeared to be Montgomery men. "We're getting close," Elijah said as they crested a small rise. In the distance, the buildings of Leeds Point were visible. A modest collection of structures centered around what appeared to be a main street, with a white church steeple rising above the other rooftops. "How do we approach?" James asked. "If they're watching the roads—" "We don't use the roads." Elijah pointed to a stream that wound its way toward the settlement. "That creek runs behind the row of businesses on the east side of town. Miller's office is the third building in. We'll come up along the water and approach from the rear." As they drew nearer to Leeds Point, signs of civilization became more frequent. Fenced fields, an occasional farmhouse in the distance, well-worn paths intersecting their route. They moved with increasing caution, keeping to stands of trees and gullies wherever possible. The sun was low in the western sky by the time they reached the creek Elijah had described. They followed its course until the backs of Leeds Point's businesses came into view, simple clapboard structures with storage sheds and privies dotting the area between the buildings and the creek. "That's it," Elijah whispered, pointing to a two-story building with Leeds Point Gazette painted on its rear door. A small press was visible through the ground floor window, but no movement could be detected inside. "Wait here," James said. "If something goes wrong, you can still get word to Judge Hammond." Elijah shook his head firmly. "We go together. Mother Esther would have my hide if I let you walk into a trap alone." They approached cautiously, staying low and using the scattered outbuildings for cover. As they neared the newspaper office, James noted with concern that no lamps were lit inside despite the gathering dusk. The press room appeared deserted. "Is it normally closed at this hour?" he whispered. Elijah frowned. "Printing day is Thursday. Should be working late." A sense of foreboding settled over James as they reached the rear door. It stood slightly ajar, unusual for a business, especially as evening approached. James pushed it open slowly, wincing at the creak of hinges. The interior was dim, illuminated only by the fading daylight through the windows. The press stood silent, half covered by a canvas drop-cloth. Papers were scattered across the floor, and a chair lay overturned near a small desk. "Something's wrong," Elijah murmured. James nodded, moving cautiously into the room. The scattered papers appeared to be recent editions of the Gazette and various correspondence. Nothing seemed overtly disturbing until he reached the desk and saw dark stains on the floorboards beside it, stains that looked unnervingly like dried blood. "Elijah," he called softly, pointing to the stains. Before Elijah could respond, a floorboard creaked overhead. Both men froze, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Footsteps moved across the upper floor, then began descending a staircase at the front of the building. James reached for the pistol in his pocket, drawing it with trembling fingers. One bullet. If it was a Montgomery man, he would have to make it count. A figure appeared in the doorway, connecting to the front of the building. A woman in her 40s, her face pale with fatigue or fear, her clothes rumpled as though she'd been wearing them for days. When she saw the two men, she gasped and raised a small derringer. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her hand. "What do you want?" James slowly lowered his pistol. "We're looking for Thaddeus Miller. I'm Dr. James Whitfield from Philadelphia. This is Elijah. We mean no harm." The woman didn't lower her gun. "My husband isn't here. He was taken 2 days ago." "Taken?" Elijah asked. "By whom?" "Men working for the Montgomerys." She spat the name. "They came in the night, dragged him from our bed, said he was spreading lies about respectable citizens." Her eyes narrowed. "What business do you have with my husband?" James exchanged a look with Elijah before deciding on honesty. "I was at Magnolia Hill. I witnessed atrocities being committed there, experiments on enslaved women. I escaped and hoped your husband might help expose what's happening." Mrs. Miller studied him for a long moment, then slowly lowered the derringer. "You're not the first to bring such stories. 2 years ago, a woman escaped from Magnolia Hill, came to Thaddeus with tales of medical horrors. He began investigating, writing carefully worded articles, questioning the unusual mortality rate among Montgomery slaves. "What happened to her?" James asked, though he feared he knew the answer. "Found hanged from a tree outside town. Authorities called it suicide." Her voice was bitter. "After that, Thaddeus backed away from the story. Until last week, when another woman came. Ruth, she called herself. She brought documents, pages from some kind of medical journal. Thaddeus was preparing an exposé." "Ruth came here?" Elijah asked sharply. "From Mother Esther's settlement?" Mrs. Miller nodded. "She mentioned a woman by that name, said a doctor from Philadelphia might be coming with more evidence." James felt a surge of hope mixed with fear. "Where is Ruth now?" "Gone. Fled when they took Thaddeus. She left this." Mrs. Miller moved to the press and lifted the canvas dropcloth, revealing a small leather-bound book tucked beneath it. "Said it was evidence that should reach a Judge Hammond, who arrives tomorrow for the circuit court session. Frederick Montgomery's journal, or at least part of it. Ruth must have obtained it from Mother Esther and brought it ahead to Leeds Point, while James and Elijah took the slower swamp route. "This is exactly what we need," James said, reaching for the journal. "With this and my testimony, Judge Hammond can issue warrants for the Montgomerys' arrest. If you can reach him," Mrs. Miller said grimly. "They're watching the courthouse, 2 men stationed there day and night since they took Thaddeus." "Where are they holding your husband?" Elijah asked. "County jail, allegedly for printing libelous materials. But the sheriff answers to the Montgomerys. I fear they'll hang him as an example," James thought quickly. "When exactly does Judge Hammond arrive?" "Tomorrow noon stage from Vicksburg. Court session begins at 2. Then we need to intercept him before he reaches town," James decided. "Meet the stage on the road, explain the situation before the Montgomerys can influence him." Mrs. Miller nodded slowly. "It might work." The stage stops at Wilson's Tavern on the North Road, about 3 miles out, to change horses. Hammond always takes lunch there before coming into town. "We'll meet him there," James said, tucking the journal securely into his coat. "Mrs. Miller, is there somewhere safe you can go? If the Montgomerys learn you've helped us..." My sister lives in Portsmouth. I've been planning to join her, just needed to learn what happened to Thaddeus first. She hesitated. If you succeed in exposing the Montgomerys, what happens to their victims? It was a question James had asked himself repeatedly since fleeing Magnolia Hill. I don't know, he admitted, but bringing their crimes to light is the first step toward justice. They left Mrs. Miller packing what few belongings she could carry, promising to send word of their success or failure through Underground Railroad contacts. Night had fallen completely as they slipped away from the newspaper office, following the creek north out of town. Wilson's Tavern is about 2 hours' walk, Elijah said once they were safely away from Leeds Point. We can rest there in the woods, approach when the stage arrives. As they walked, James's thoughts returned to Ruth. Her courage in bringing the journal to Leeds Point despite the dangers. Her determination to expose the Montgomerys, even after what they had done to her. He wondered how many others had tried and failed over the years, their stories dismissed or silenced, their suffering continuing behind Magnolia Hill's grand white columns. The journal in his coat felt heavier than its physical weight, laden with the testimony of countless victims. Tomorrow, one way or another, the truth about the Montgomerys would finally come to light. Unless, of course, they had anticipated this move as well, and Judge Hammond's stage never reached Wilson's Tavern at all. This was only the beginning. The darkness continues in part 2. Subscribe now so you don't miss it.